Welcome to Awakening into Life, where we host an ongoing series of conversations regarding the nature of non-duality, self-realization, and the embodiment of awakening, all offered freely from the heart of Bradley. In this week's session, we will be continuing our Campaign of Consciousness series, specifically talking about facing and letting go of our pain. So welcome everyone to the fourth session in our Campaign of Consciousness series. And tonight we're going to be talking about facing and letting go of our pain. And before I get started, I just want to remind everyone that these are open, free online sessions. They are recorded and they are also broadcast on Facebook Live. And so if you would feel more comfortable with your cameras turned off and with your microphone muted, please feel free. You're welcome to participate in whatever manner you're most comfortable with. There's no requirement that you expose yourself or anything along those lines. And then also before we dive in, I just want to open up an opportunity to talk a little bit about some of the material that we've covered so far, because we're at about the halfway point now. In our first session, we talked about what is awakening, and I was talking about it as a fundamental psychological shift in perception. And in our second session, we were talking about loving yourself, trusting yourself, and honoring your own journey. And we're going to reach back into some of that material this evening as we talk about this process of facing ourselves and facing our psychological suffering and letting go. And then last week, we talked a bit about mindfulness and meditation. It really sort of beginning to cultivate a skill set that makes it possible, or rather helps us engage in the kind of work we're going to be talking about tonight. So before we get into all that, I just want to open it up and see if anybody has any questions or anything that they want to discuss about what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I would really like to say, I apologize for not being able to make last week. I had to do some self-care and go to bed early.
Sure.
But some of the things that really stuck out to me with like the belly breathing, and I wish that I could give credit where credit is due on this, because I don't recall where I learned this. But if you watch a baby sleep, it's their stomach that rises and falls. And then as we get older, we learn this technique of breathing only with our chest. So if you see an adult, their chest is rising and falling and their stomach is barely moving. And you talked about, breathing into the belly. And once I had learned that, watched it, read it, whatever it was, I started breathing from my stomach and noticed just the huge difference in the way it makes you feel. And especially once you bring the mindfulness to that moment, to that you're breathing into your diaphragm, expanding that, filling the lungs, and then releasing it all instead of taking those shallow lung breaths. It definitely, I loved it when you said that. I was like, yes, finally somebody who sees the importance of how you breathe, not just the fact that you're breathing. The other huge thing I really took away from last week was being present with the discomfort. Like you explained, like the itch or the pain. I've suffered from headaches and migraines like my entire life. And one of the things that I learned with minor headaches, and before they become major ones, is if you explore that pain. I feel this sensation in this spot of my head, and you focus on that pain, you live through that pain, you intensify it. And then when you step back, the pain is gone or severely diminished. I mean, I'm not, like you said, bring wisdom into it. I do take a leave if I need to, or Tylenol, but I found that it cuts back my use of those type of over-the-counter painkillers when you can just focus on that pain and really feel it and then back off. And I think that kind of leads into, I'm hoping anyway, what it leads into that we're getting to tonight, because
Yes.
it is an important part of being and also healing, is it just feeling that pain with everything you have.
Yes. Yeah. And to that point, thank you for sharing that. That's really lovely. And those are wonderful insights and things to share. To your point, you know, one of the things that I try to really communicate and convey to people is most of us go on this, what we might call a spiritual journey, in an effort to achieve enlightenment, right? Or to awaken, right? And we have this idea in our head about this mystical state of absolute perfection where all of our worries disappear. And that is not at all what any master or any awakened being has ever pointed at, ever. This is about being completely present with life as it is. This is sort of reaching into the understanding of our non-separateness, of the unified nature of being, and, you know, sort of acknowledging the what we might call the human experience as a functional aspect of being. And, you know, within our experience of life, it comes with good things that we like, and it comes with difficult things that we don't like. And most of us, we're on this journey because we're trying to escape the things we don't like. And all that does is lead to striving and increase or continue the cycle of suffering, because we will sit here and we'll beat ourselves up about, why am I not getting it yet? Why am I not there yet? Why haven't I awoken yet or become enlightened yet? If I have a sensation or an emotion or a thought, it must mean I'm not there. And, you know, the most predominant theme in the way that I explain these things, and the way most other sort of teachers in this tradition or in this discipline do, is that you're never not that. And, you know, our experience of life, every experience of life, is the richness of life. You know, it's so it's like, yes, there's an itch, yes, there's a pain, yes, there's a headache, yes, there's an emotional feeling or a psychological response to something. All of that is a part of this dance. And rather than trying to escape it or transcend it, the way that we transcend it is by embracing it, by embracing all of it, right? That's the most essential part of this whole thing. You know, it's like to recognize that what we call awakening or what we call enlightenment is really an invitation for all of life to be what life is, you know? And so, yeah, and you're right, it's going to enter right into this conversation about our psychological and emotional suffering, our discomfort, and going into the depths of those events or those experiences that have shaped us and given rise to our conditioned sense of self that's sort of in this dance or trying to push things away, trying to escape, trying to transcend. So thank you for sharing those things. Is there anything else? Any other comments or thoughts? Let me look here on Facebook as well. All right. Well, wonderful. Yeah, so let me start by saying that there's a lot of very difficult and challenging work that's present in really encountering ourselves. You know, we spend so much of our life trying to distract ourselves so that we're not alone with ourselves. Because if we're alone with ourselves, then we're sort of faced with ourselves. You know, it's sort of like if you sit in a quiet room for half an hour and do nothing, you know, and you're just there with your thoughts. You're just there with your experience. And most of us, we haven't necessarily done the kind of inner work that makes us conscious of our experience in a way that allows us to be present with those things. And so what happens is when we sit alone with ourselves without having done any real work or investigation or examination, we find all the tragedies of our lives sort of emerging or coming to the surface, right? And so, of course, you know, if we're alone with ourselves and that voice kicks in and it says, hey, you know, you're not good enough, and here's why you're not good enough. Remember that time in 3rd grade when you ate paste and the whole class made fun of you? You know, like, or this situation that happened when you were, you know, a young child and you were abandoned or traumatized in some way. You know, remember at the school dance when you tripped and you knocked over the punch bowl, and, you know, I mean, like, that's the kind of stuff that tends to come forward when we're alone with ourselves. It's almost like we turn the volume down on life, and the very first thing that happens is this small voice inside of us goes, hey, thanks for giving me a chance to tell you how you're getting it wrong. And so the other thing is that when we listen to non-dual spiritual teachers, there's a range, there's a continuum of teachers and teachings in this space. On one end of the spectrum, we may have non-dual teachers who will sit and very correctly say to us, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to do, there's no one to be, you are already that, and that's the end of it, right? That all of this seeking, all of this work, all of this stuff is completely unnecessary. All you need to do is see the seeing. Just see this, just witness the witnessing, just observe the observation, just, you know. And so they're really trying to invite us into the silence and the simplicity of pure being. And on the other end of the spectrum, you may have teachers who are talking about an embracing of all of life, you know, a drawing in of the entire experience. And it's not that one perspective or one end of the spectrum is more non-dual than the other. It has more to do with the kind of teacher that you're working with. You know, because it's so essential that we sort of encounter emptiness or see through the veil of language, recognize that, you know, the relative subjective reality that we're experiencing is really just a projection of our own conditioned minds. It's absolutely essential to this process to see that in your own direct experience. It's something that we really can't avoid or get away from. If we haven't had that clarity, then chances are there's still some aspect of our experience that may be very confusing or disconcerting or troubling, because we're still trying to get somewhere or get something. And so there are a lot of teachers who are really trying to make that the predominant theme of their teaching, and rightfully so. But there's a point in the journey at which what we recognize is that non-duality doesn't mean there's a barrier that says, here I am as awareness, and I am aware of all of these things that are happening, right? There's a moment or a point at which we begin to recognize that all of the things that are happening are none other than awareness. And so non-duality transitions from that idea of, you know, of a duality into true non-duality, or we could say an enlightened duality, right? Where the not two, non-duality means not two, and it means everything's together as one. And we could say that when you step into that, it becomes nothing. It sort of empties itself out. So it's not even one, you know, as you go through it. So there's just life breathing itself in and breathing itself out. That's really, this enlightened duality is really what we're ultimately aiming for, if we're aiming for anything at all. But there are certain things that it's important for us to see. And so Some people I'll work with and I'll be talking to them very clearly about getting out of their heads and getting out of their ideas and notions and beliefs and attachment to language and thought. And that is all I'll focus with on them, because they want to grasp at something, right? And so we've got to break that tendency of grasping. But then somebody might come to me and they might say, I've seen it all, and I realize that everything is emptiness. And I don't know, I'm sort of not really, I really feel like I'm still looking for something. And then I'm like, okay, well, where you're at, what we're really talking about is learning to inhabit or embody your direct experience, right? To get to that place where you recognize what non-duality really is about, right? Which is that more enlightened duality. There's a place for the dance of duality in life. That's how consciousness expresses and experiences itself. We could say it that way, right? And this is all consciousness, and this is just play of things. This is how it is. So the reason I bring these things up is to understand that sometimes when we go into a non-dual setting or sit with a non-dual teacher or participate in a non-dual group, it's almost like there might be a one-size-fits-all approach, right? Just sit quietly and meditate and watch the observer. And when you see that you are the observer and the observed and that there's no distinction between the two, then you'll have it, right? I would argue, however, that at least in the mindset of the conditioned mind, especially the Western mind, right? We have been so strongly conditioned into a personal sense of self and a personal sense of lack that it's really important for us to do some kind of inner work and not to just be satisfied or content with what's ultimately really referred to as spiritual bypassing, right? Where we'll sit, we're on high, you know, we're in the absolute. I am in the absolute view, and I can do this just as well as any. I am in the absolute view, the formless, shapeless, you know, absolute reality from which there is no separation or division from. You know, we can have that kind of a conversation. But so what? That's ultimately the way I look at it and the way I explain. So what? You know, you still got to get up in the morning and go to work and pay your bills, and taxes are still going to be due. And, you know, I mean, you still got kids to raise and, you know, things to do around that. That's life. That's what life is made of. And so if you're busy being on high and disconnected from all of that and detached from all of that, perhaps it's not the most psychologically sound way of approaching life. Perhaps sometimes it is, perhaps sometimes it isn't. This is a dance after all. But I really want to sort of make room here for the understanding that you, as you are right now, are whole and perfect and complete, lacking nothing. And there really isn't anywhere to go. Everything is right here already in this moment. This moment, the eternal moment, is absolutely perfect. It's flawless. You're flawless. At the same time that is true, there's also this beautiful opportunity to see how the moment unfolds into deeper levels of conscious understanding and recognition, into deeper levels of ownership and responsibility. Even though you can sit here and say there's no self to be responsible, and yet there's a self to be responsible. It's these wonderful paradoxes that infuse the entire non-dual community of teachings, where, you know, if we're really going to inhabit and embody our experience, it includes doing work. It really does. It includes meditation. It includes contemplation. It includes, you know, going in and working with a therapist or you know, taking medications if that's what's necessary for you. I mean, this is really about, again, inviting life to be what life is. Right? It's not about reaching some penny ultimate state where all of this disappears. If that's your goal, all I can say is good luck. None of us have arrived at that place. The place that we have arrived is that recognition. I am this one. And this one is all of this. All of this is this one. And this one is beyond numbers, words, language, concepts, ideas, notions, beliefs. I cannot capture it or contain it or constrain it in any way. It's infinite and ineffable, whole and complete. And man, the best thing I can do is just surrender into the mystery of myself, surrender into the mystery of being. That's really the best we can ever hope for. So when we get into this conversation about something like facing and letting go of our pain, some people who come to this sort of non-dual orientation are going to come to it from a perspective that says, I don't really need to do anything. I'm good. I already have the absolute. And I'm just sharing these tidbits here for those people to really help set the tone for saying, that's true. And guess what? There's still work to be done because there's a human experience being had. And you can sit here and say to me, but that's just a definition. That's a concept. That's a model. And I can say, yes, absolutely true. But somewhere at some point, your experience of yourself has to go to the bathroom. At some point, somewhere, your experience of you has to encounter difficulties. Somewhere, somehow, that experience of you has to encounter life. And if you're not encountering life, you're missing. So that's all sort of a lead into this conversation about facing and letting go of our pain. Now I'm just checking in here to see. All right. The other thing that I want to talk about here is the importance of seeking proper therapeutic help. Okay. Especially if we've had, serious traumas, because again, if we go into a setting where it's one size fits all, right? Here you have this enlightened master who's just saying, just own yourself into this wonderful state. That's great. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. But what I am saying is that approach doesn't account for the fact that, in a room of 10 people, maybe you have one person who's struggling with abandonment issues, another person who was traumatized sexually as a child, another person who is dealing with, significant psychological problems. Perhaps they're psychotic, or you've got somebody in there who's contemplating suicidal ideations. I mean, these are important psychological factors that have to be accounted for when you're working with people in any kind of exploratory context. And a lot of the Eastern traditions don't necessarily embrace that as much as the Western traditions do. And the Western traditions, really are coming out of philosophy, and out of that comes psychology, right? And counseling and all these other forms of therapy. And if you're someone who is struggling with traumas and issues and challenges and a history of abuse, whatever it is for you, it's really important to get the help that you need to move through these historical issues and challenges. Again, just to sit there and sort of occupy the absolute view while ignoring your actual experience, that isn't wisdom. It isn't wisdom at all, right? It's being fearful of approaching yourself, being fearful of being present with yourself. Embrace your fear and conquer your fear by taking the opportunity to work within yourself, to see how it is that consciousness is moving through you and inviting you into a deeper relationship with itself. You are consciousness, and this is you learning what consciousness really is and how it expresses itself in the world. It's deep expression of love. It's deep expression of compassion. It's deep expression of being. So there are a lot of non-dual teachers that are also therapists, um, who have brought this merging of Eastern and Western traditions together in a way that can really help people deal with their psychological issues while also exploring non-dual realization. And I'll actually send out an email, and I'll put on the Facebook group a link to a wonderful directory of non-dual therapists where you can go and look at people who do this work. Myself and my girlfriend Lisa, we're both students in mental health counseling programs. I'm at Walden University and she's at Palo Alto University. And we have recognized as non-dual teachers the essential importance of being able to help people deal with the psychological issues that come up as a part of this awakening process. And so we're really committed to learning the tools and the techniques that are of value. And when I, very shortly after my awakening experience, right, this whole framework that I talk through, it sort of emerged sort of naturally and immediately within the first few months. And the structure was, tilting in the direction of awakening. What is that? What does it mean? Right? Loving yourself, trusting yourself, and honoring your own journey, because most of us aren't doing that, right? Learning mindfulness and meditation because we need tools and techniques that help us go through this process in a meaningful way. Facing and letting go of our pain, because so many of us, we're weighed down by all of our yesterdays, so much so that we cannot be fully present with today. All of our actions and behaviors and thoughts are being unconsciously governed by who it is that we think we are because of what it is that we've experienced. And so that has to be dealt with. And then synchronicity, paying attention to synchronicity, which we'll talk about next week. And then being wary of our traps and how those things really present themselves as opportunities to learn and grow and to understand more deeply this relationship that we have with ourselves as consciousness. And then finally, the dance of fear and surrender, all the ways that we're going to go, oh no, this isn't true. Oh my gosh, no, this isn't right, and how to sort of contend with those things. All of that came forward really immediately. But it took me about 3.5, 4 years of teaching to recognize that so many people were caught either in the distancing or the spiritual bypassing, or people were so caught up in histories of trauma that they weren't really in a position to even begin to do the kind of inner work that we talk about in non-dual circles. And so it became really essential to start to study clinical work and counseling in order to help move people through some of these things. So I would encourage you not to look at non-duality or non-dual teachings as an alternative to doing real psychological work with a trained professional who understands what it is you're going through and can help move you through some of it. And there are some wonderful therapeutic models out there. For instance, acceptance and commitment therapy or internal family systems theory. These are just a couple of examples. So you can go out and find people who have training in some of these things. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about this nexus between non-duality and psychology, you can pick up a copy of the book, The Sacred Mirror, which is a collection of essays written by therapists and teachers in the non-dual community. And there's a follow-up book, a second book in the series called Listening from the Heart of Silence, which is the Non-Duality and Psychotherapy Volume 2, another collection of essays that are written by therapists and non-dual teachers who have a great deal of experience with one foot in each world. All right, so that's a long preparatory conversation to help just set the stage and point out what's really important when we do this deeper work.
Hey, Bradley.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Sorry. Would you be able to share those resources in the email?
Absolutely. I absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep. Totally. All right, so one of the reasons why I go through this series in the way that I do, and I put mindfulness and meditation before facing and letting go of our pain, is so that we can start to recognize the inner resources that are available to us when we start asking some hard questions about ourselves. And being able to go into a breathing technique, being able to center ourselves in the breath, center ourselves in the heart, or center ourselves in the belly, and to just really be present with our experience, that's sort of it's a place that we can go within ourselves. You know, we can, it also helps, as I said last week, it helps us take a step back from the identification that we may have with our thoughts and feelings and emotions, right? And because if we're deeply identified with the thoughts, feelings, and emotions that appear, then when we start doing any kind of real inner work and we start to have difficult thoughts, feelings, and emotions arise, we may start to think to ourselves that we're doing it wrong, or that something's not right about this work. Isn't this awakening thing supposed to make me happy? Isn't this supposed to be about cultivating inner joy? I must be doing it wrong. But as I've already indicated, the reality of this situation is so many of our thoughts and so much of our behavior is being governed by unconscious patterns that we need to make those unconscious patterns conscious. And the only way we can do that is by really going back into our own histories and saying, all right, you know, let me look at my life as it is today, and let me see where it is that I'm caught up in certain patterns. You know, am I somebody who's exposing myself to bad relationship situations or bad work situations, or you know, having these engagements in communities that make me deeply unhappy? You know, or is my life in such utter chaos that it's reflective of somebody who may not be loving themselves or taking care of themselves in a meaningful way? So being really honest with ourselves, radically self-honest with ourselves, is essential. And I'll use my own experience, and I try not to put too much of my own experience in this series, but for tonight, I think it's important to do so. Next week, I will too, on the synchronicity stuff, just because it's fun. But so it was in September of 2014, I was going through a deep psychological crisis, or an existential crisis. And I was suffering tremendously, just so much psychological suffering in my experience. And what I began to recognize was that when I was about 8 years old, about 7 or 8 years old, my parents had gotten divorced. We were living in Cuba at the time. My father was in the Navy. And my father sort of just disappeared from our lives. And my mother, my little brother, and I, we moved to Florida, and we were living with my aunt in Florida. We were there for a few months. And yeah, I wasn't the greatest kid at the time. I was having some difficulties adjusting and adapting. And at a certain point, my mom told me, hey, we're all going on vacation up to New Jersey to see the grandparents. We'll be up there for a week or two. And so at 7 or 8 years old, we're in New Jersey. We've been there for a week or two. It's time to go home. My mom kneels down in front of me and says, you know, probably in a nicer way than I would remember it, but hey, you're not going home. You know, I'm going and I'm taking your brother, but I'm going to leave you here with your grandparents. And so there was this really tremendous, I'd already lost my father in this equation, right? And so here I was, where my mother had stepped in and basically said, hey, you know what? I can't deal with this. Now, again, this is the perception of a 7 or 8 year old child. You know, my father didn't love me, and he left, and now my mother doesn't love me, and she left. And my grandparents, you know, they were old. They didn't really know, you know, how to contend with a child that was going through what I was going through. And so in order to respond to that sort of interpretation of events, I had to make myself lovable. And so I started to wear all these masks, right? And this is what many of us do. We wear a mask to make our self-love. But in the process of wearing all these masks, I became resentful of the fact that I couldn't be myself. I couldn't be my authentic self. And so what began to emerge was a very narcissistic personality that was deeply dysfunctional and, was angry and really caused a lot of trouble in life in general for myself. And that continued on for years. It was not until 2014 that I began to ask these questions. And I wasn't spiritual. I had no interest in spirituality. I had studied Buddhism for about a year, 10 years before this period. But I started to ask the question, who am I? Who am I behind these masks? And that question, asked with this sort of sense of radical self-honesty, began to shed. There was a process of shedding layers. And in this process of shedding layers, I had to call my mom and have a conversation with her. Like, I'm 42 years old and I'm having this conversation with mom about what happened when I was 8, right? And through snot and tears, we got to the bottom of it, and I began to understand it wasn't really my fault, right? And that it didn't have anything to do with me. And then, I had to go through this process again, through snot and tears, of, sort of going back into the different relationships, the major relationships that I had had in my life, with people that I was in romantic relationship with, and really start to apologize for my behavior, to ask for forgiveness. And I started to go through this process of forgiving myself, of really looking very deeply and very closely at how my behavior had manifested itself, why my behavior had manifested itself. Not to make excuses for it, to take complete ownership, but to also do so from a place of deep compassion, because these are the responses of a 7 or 8-year-old child who was never able to grow up or mature beyond that sort of glass ceiling, that limit, right? Of being 7 or 8. And so I spent my whole life as a 7 or 8-year-old child, responding and reacting with that maturity. And that's, so most of us, even if it's not, we have these stories about major traumas, right? And when we think of trauma, we generally tend to think in terms of major issues, major things that have happened. But so many, a small child just wants attention. That's all they want. They want love. They want attention. They want to be seen. They want to be heard. They want to be attended to. That's what they want more than anything in the world. And any of us who are parents or have raised children or been around children, we all know we have finite resources when it comes to delivering on some of those expectations that children may have. And so the very basic reality of things is that we cannot necessarily meet all of those expectations or attention-seeking behaviors on the part of the child, even if we wanted to. It's almost impossible to do so, at least in the society that we live in today. And so it might be so simple as to say that a child is traumatized in the way that they don't get everything they want, and they start to figure out new ways of getting what it is they want. Getting attention, right? New ways of being seen, new ways of being heard. And for a child, it doesn't necessarily matter whether they're getting positive or negative attention. All that matters is that they're being seen or being heard, right? And so our personalities generally tend to form in response to the way that we're raised. The ways that we're conditioned into our experience of society, through our family systems. And it's important to be able to look back and to ask ourselves, well, what was missing in my childhood? What was absent there? Maybe there was a major traumatic issue or something that needs real attention, but we can't sort of adopt the attitude of, well, I had a good upbringing, things were good for me, I don't really have any complaints, I'm not sure why I have these issues. looking back into our history, into our childhoods, it's really important to just acknowledge, man, my parents did the best they could, and maybe they weren't there in the way that I wanted them to be, and to start having that conversation with yourself about the reality of things, right? Put yourself in their position, right? Take the perspective of what they were trying to do, and acknowledge or recognize that, as parents, these people brought their own unconscious thoughts and behaviors to the process of child rearing. And for a lot of generations in Western society, people weren't all that interested in self-exploration. That didn't really start to become a predominant theme until about the 60s. And so there are a lot of generations, including for many of us, our parents' generations, where it was like, we don't talk about our feelings, we don't talk about what's happening. If you're going to go in that direction, there's something wrong with you, so we were conditioned into this place where we weren't able to express ourselves fully or express ourselves completely. We were taught that there was something wrong with that. So we've internalized a lot of it. So I just, going into this conversation about facing and letting go of our pain, it starts with our earliest childhood experiences and our earliest childhood memories, the families that we were born into, and the systems and structures of those families, and how our relationships with the members of our family systems really informed and influenced who it is that we have become. There's this little sort of introductory speech that I used to give a lot of times. And at a certain point, I would say, when we are born into this world as children, we are born with a clean slate, with a clear mind. It is the first time that a parent says to us, this is your foot, this is your nose, this is a bowl, and this is a kite. This is right, and this is wrong. That is the moment at which our conditioning began. It continued through work and school, with every social interaction that we've ever had. Every single social interaction has added another layer of conditioning. And eventually, all of these layers of conditioning have become an I am that is not. And in this, we find ourselves lost. And so it really does begin at the beginning with the way that we were raised and socialized and taught to be. And that's really where most of us need to start. Most of the deepest things that are influencing who we are today are right there somewhere in our early childhood, in our early memories. So I'll continue on, but I want to create a space here, a moment to just see if anyone has any questions or anything that they want to talk about or share at this point within the conversation. Okay. All right. The other place that we really find ourselves being shaped is in the dynamics of relationship, especially and specifically with our significant others. All right. So, and this starts again sort of in our teenage years, we could say. So we can say that early childhood, we're primarily being shaped by family influences. But as we get older and we get to a place where we start to take an interest, right, in romantic interludes, shall we say, we expose ourselves and we express ourselves to a person whose attention we really want to get. And we're going to sort of rely on a lot of the things that we've learned through our family systems. Our patterns of interaction are largely going to be governed by the very same ways that we interacted with our family systems. And, it's it's really interesting to note how we kind of repeat a lot of the kinds of things that brought us great difficulty and suffering as children through the dynamics of relationship. It's almost like, you know, we have something to prove to ourselves, or we're just so unconscious in our experience of ourselves that we don't even realize what it is that we're doing. You know, we're partnering up with somebody who is very likely going to behave in a manner that's consistent with what we're used to. And if we were not being seen, and we were not being loved, and we were not being cared for, and, you know, we're trying to sort of still get that from another person, we're going to bring all of that into our relationship, into our demands and expectations of the other person. And what we tend to find, I think most of us can agree, is that when we bring demands and expectations into the dynamics of romantic relationship, it usually doesn't work out so well. You know, it's this this idea of you complete me, right? You as my romantic partner are responsible for my happiness. Yeah. And then when the person doesn't live up to that, it just goes sideways. And then we're in conflict, and then conflict leads to breakdown, and breakdown leads to breakup, right? And so looking at how our relationships sort of demonstrate to us where we need to do work presents us with a beautiful opportunity. There are a lot of teachers in various spiritual traditions that will say that relationship is really our greatest opportunity for healing. The dynamics of romantic relationship, that's really our greatest opportunity for real healing. But we sort of have to be in a place where we're willing to use it that way, you know, where we're willing to engage in relationship as a way to become more conscious. And that's something that you really have to do together. It's like, you know, that has to be part of the agreement that's made when you're coming together. Because if you're trying to use the relationship to work on yourself and become more conscious, and the other person is still in the stage of demands and expectations, then your efforts to sort of deepen into your own understanding may not be in alignment with their demands and expectations. And so, you know, it can be difficult in relationship when one person is more deeply aligned or attuned with this kind of inner work, and the other person isn't. And that's just something we have to navigate. There's a wonderful book by the licensed marriage and family therapist Lynn Marie Lumiere that's called Awakened Relating, that gets into a lot of these things, right? Parenting styles and attachment styles, and how those play out in relationship, and how we can use relationship as a way to open ourselves up to healing, to dealing with those unconscious patterns of behavior. So relationship. And what's also interesting is how every time that we had a relationship go sideways or break down or break up, it sort of gets filed away somewhere in the psychological system. And it helps reinforce the story, I'm not good enough. I'll never be lovable. No one will ever love me. I'm always going to get it wrong. I'm going to be alone forever. I'm going to die alone. I have heard this from many people, you know, who really feel very strongly drawn to relationship as the means by which happiness will be achieved. And there's a fear that without that ability or opportunity to share, that the person is incomplete, which isn't true, of course, but it becomes another aspect of striving and attempting to deal with what's in here by grasping or clinging to what appears to be out there. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work, because ultimately, again, as part of this understanding, we begin to realize that everything is of the same nature, right? That the world of appearances is temporary and ephemeral. It's ever shifting and ever changing. And if we try to grab something out there in order to fulfill what's in here, it's going to shift, it's going to change, right? And because we're attached or clinging or identified with or bound up in, our happiness is bound up in that externalized thing, whether it's a person, place, thing, idea, or experience, doesn't matter. That externalized thing, when it shifts or changes, we go, oh no, it's all falling apart. But the reality is it's all coming together. Because your experience of being disappointed or disillusioned is inviting you to recognize that the world that appears out there is actually born in here. And draws us into that place where we begin to take ownership and responsibility for the world of our own mental creation and formation. And again, I use these terms responsibility and ownership loosely because, you know, this question of is there a self or isn't there a self is kind of it's a moving target, right? But this is not so much about answering a philosophical question as it is about dealing with a practical reality. So this invitation, the disappointment and disillusionment that comes from things in the world falling apart, which creates psychological suffering, really becomes a red flag moment of saying, what is it that I'm attached to? What is it that I'm holding on to? What is it that I need to let go of? What is it that I need to allow for? I did a whole teaching one time at one of the Zen centers on suffering as our greatest teacher for exactly this reason. Because it's like whenever suffering arises, it's a red flag moment. Hey, here's your work. Here it is right here. In this moment, in your suffering, this is your work. To look at it closely and ask, why is there this attachment? Why is there this demand? Why is there this sense or belief that things should be some other way than the way that they are? What is it you're trying to avoid or escape or get away from or get out of because you don't like it, because it doesn't feel good to you? What it is that doesn't feel good is really ultimately boils down to the fact that you're not in control of it. We, as in our human experience, especially in a conditioned, unexamined life, right, we are longing for a sense of safety and security. And the only way that we can accomplish the goal of establishing safety and security is by exercising control. And the more tightly we try to control our circumstances, the better off we're going to be, right? Of course not. Life itself tends to reject our efforts to control by casting us into chaos, by putting us in these dramatic scenes that are really there to expose our misunderstanding. But most of us, we're not seeing it that way. We're not approaching it that way. Instead, what we do is we look outward, and we do so with blame, right? It's not a problem in here. It's not anything that needs to be dealt with in here. It's out there. It's your fault. This person or that person is responsible for upsetting me or breaking my heart or making life difficult. It's their fault. They're the ones who need to change. They're the ones who have to fix it. It's not my problem. It's your problem. And I will tell you that, you know, so many people that I've worked with in the past, that's the first thing they do. You know, they come, especially people who are coming because of relationship issues. They'll come and that's the first thing. I really don't feel like I need to work on anything, but so-and-so needs to work on it, right? If they would just do the things that are on my checklist, this would all be much easier. If they would just obey. But it takes a kind of courage to look at the circumstances of our lives and to look at our suffering and to say, wow, maybe there's something in here that needs my attention. Maybe rather than the changeful realm of name and form that appears to be real, appears to be substantial, maybe that deserves sort of a questioning mind, a contemplative mind, a kind of rationality. Okay? Am I willing to engage with earnestness and sincerity in the process of inner exploration rather than outer blame? This is a huge transformational moment for many people who are able to acknowledge that inward facing direction that this kind of work really demands, and that our suffering and our disillusionment is really inviting us into. So we've already covered how some of this stuff comes up or is born into our experience of being through childhood related issues. We've also talked about romantic relationship issues. I'm just trying to cover some of the big ticket items. Another one that is very obvious to most of us is around finances, is around money, is around success, is around having enough. Having enough. You know, this is an area where a lot of people have a lot of psychological suffering around, because it seems like there's never enough. It seems like there always needs to be more. There's this conditioned notion of being incomplete until we've met society's checklist, right? I need the education, check. I need the car, check. The house, check. The spouse, check. The kids, check. Right? Again, we're attempting to fulfill ourselves through the externalized experience of life rather than sort of investigating. And if we're unconscious and we're sort of just along for the ride with society, right? We're allowing society to govern our lives, then we may not be willing to sort of disengage or disconnect from those social expectations and begin to look really honestly at our own experience rather than those expectations. So something like the drivers for success, right? Which really comes back to, in our society, comes back to money. I have to make if I make a 6-figure salary, then that'll get me there, right? If I do this or that. And I'll tell you, as somebody who's been in the IT cybersecurity industry for many, many years and had a 6-figure salary, and had the house and had the car and had the relationships, all I can say is, when you have those things and you're still unhappy, it's a clue. It's a clue. It's an opportunity to recognize that perhaps that's not where our happiness is to be found. I remember there's a quote that goes around sometimes on Facebook from Jim Carrey, who went through a very profound experience of awakening himself a few years ago. Because here he's an actor taking on roles, and I can't remember which movie it was, but he started talking about the fact that he couldn't distinguish himself from the characters anymore, and it really forced him into a place of deep inner examination. And poof, the walls fell down, and he went, "Oh crap! I don't know who I am. Wow, this is actually reality." So anyway, his quote has something to do with saying, I really wish everyone could get all of the money and all of the things that their hearts desired, to realize that's not where your happiness is. So this is also kind of why we have this midlife crisis issue that will show up, when we're in our, maybe we get into our later 30s or our mid 40s or even our 50s. Doesn't really matter. There might be a moment in time where we go, all right, I've done everything I was supposed to do. I've gotten everything on the checklist, but I'm still not happy. What the hell's going on here, right? And then we're sort of forced. We can either become, in conflict with that, which creates this place where, oh, if I buy a really super cool sports car, that'll do, you know, right? Or whatever it is, you know, or get a trophy wife who's half my age, you know, these kinds of things that we see happen in our society that are a little sad to see, or sad to watch sometimes. There's this place where we can approach it differently, and rather than trying to find some new way to engage the external, instead we come to the internal. So this is really what midlife crisis is about. Everything's shifting, changing, temporary and ephemeral. I did everything I was supposed to do, and it still hasn't worked out the way it was supposed to, and I don't understand why my life still sucks. I don't understand why I'm still unhappy. I don't understand why I feel like I still have more to do. When do I get to rest? Is this my life until the day I die? Oh my goodness. How unsatisfactory is this? So money and achievement and success, as defined by our social systems and expectations, can create a great weight upon us and inspire a great deal of psychological suffering. And it can feed into that story of, I'm not good enough. It can feed into that story of, here's what else I need to do, or here's what else I need to achieve so that I will be good. And yet, right here, right now is the opportunity to turn inward and understand that you are good enough. Right now, I mean, it's not even a question. It might appear as a question to the mind, but beyond the mind, beyond the notion of not enough, is the recognition of our wholeness, our completeness, our seamless nature as the whole of reality. And how could reality itself not be enough? I can't remember where it came from, but there was this, I believe it was an Indian guru, where somebody was asking him about money, and he said, I have all the money in the world. You know, I'm consciousness, money's consciousness. I don't really concern myself with any of that. I have this richness, this resource that's, you know, infinite. You know, this isn't about me as a separate entity needing more. This is about me recognizing, oh, I'm all of it, and nothing more is needed. Whatever's here right now, that's all that's needed. And to tell ourselves otherwise, again, you know, another thing that I like to say is our suffering can best be measured as the distance between the way things are and the way that we want them to be. And to close that gap, the only way to close that gap is to work within the realm of acceptance of things as they are. The recognition that life's perfection is present in this moment. And you are that perfection in this moment, which we'll talk more about next week in our conversation around synchronicity. But this is, you know, again, our definition of success, our need for more. It's only present in those of us who have not yet discovered our inherent wholeness. And it doesn't mean that we have this recognition and suddenly it's like there's no activity left, there's no striving. What it means is that the activity, the striving, the work that we engage in, the way that we present ourselves in the world is coming forward out of a wisdom, right? It's coming forward out of a compassionate sense of service or duty, or a recognition that we have something to offer that can be helpful, that can be useful. Yeah. Again, my girlfriend and I were both working on our master's degrees. I'm planning on going directly into a PhD program. It isn't because I want to have PhD after my name, although that's cool. It really has more to do with the ability to overcome the reservations that people have when they bring their mind to inner work. Right? When you bring your mind to inner work, here I am, I'm a spiritual teacher. I can say, I had this really profound shift in consciousness and awakening. I can talk to you about it from all these different directions and perspectives. I can reach into any philosophical or spiritual or religious tradition that you might have in your mind right now, and I can show you exactly where it is in what you already see, in how you already look at the world, right? But the reality is, I'm just an IT guy who had something interesting happen, right? So how many people are going to really trust that? Versus how many people are going to go, oh, you got a doctorate in this psychology thing? Oh, you're an authority, right? So wisdom is basically saying that in order to be of the greatest help and assistance to those who are struggling with their own encounter of life, is to help overcome their objections by doing the work that I need to do in order to help assist them. Right? So it's driven out of a selfless expression of compassion. It says, hey, look, man, I can sit here and have a conversation with you right now about how to find true peace and joy in your life. But if you just see me as some guy, it's probably not going to work so well. You know, there's got to be something in it that helps you overcome your objections. Years ago, after I had my awakening experience and I was living on the streets of Seattle for 3 months, I used to sit there with my little sign that said, freely sharing the secrets of enlightenment, you know, offering free meditation lessons. And I remember this woman came up to me one evening and she said, who was your teacher? And I just looked at her and I said, well, there's only one teacher. You know, life itself is the teacher, whether it's in form or it's expressing itself through you, moving through you. It's all the same teacher. There's only consciousness. There's only the source of our being presenting itself, right? So there's only one teacher. And her response was, good luck with that. And then she stormed off. Okay? And how unfortunate this is when we're immediately bringing our conditioned notions and views and beliefs to a conversation that could be really interesting. So I'm using this as an example to suggest that we don't stop engaging in life, but the way that we start to engage in life on the other side of this understanding, it just begins to look different. It's governed by a different system of understanding, by philosophy, by engagement, by service. And it just starts to go, okay, well, let's look at it this way and this way and this way. And, you know, how do we open this up? How do we invite? How do we engage in a way that's meaningful? So it's not driven by the desire to be successful anymore or to make money, right? Or to have more. It's just not driven by it. So these are sort of the three tentpole issues: childhood issues, relationship issues, financial or success-oriented issues. Those are the biggest things that most people are coming for, you know, when they have these questions or they want to start to do this kind of inner work. They're looking for an answer that's going to help satisfy or fulfill one of those three dimensions of life. It's interesting to note that in a lot of the New Age and New Thought sort of spiritual belief systems, we hear this term abundance, right? And we hear this emphasis on manifestation, right? If you watch something like the documentary The Secret or something like that, they're sitting here and they're talking about, you know, if you vibrate at a certain frequency, you'll be able to invite to you all the things that you want, right? You can get the house, the car, the money, the spouse, all of it. You can get all of it if you just radiate at an appropriate frequency and, you know, stop doing this or stop doing that and it's like, well, that's, again, it's a really interesting philosophical perspective to take. But I like to challenge people in saying, okay, so let's say you've manifested all those things and you have everything you want. Now you have to hold on to it. What happens if suddenly it disappears? I mean, we're all destined for dirt, you know? And so you've got this magical relationship. What happens if that person suddenly disappears from your life? You know, is it then time to manifest someone new? Or you know, is that really going to fix it or fulfill us? You know, at what point do we begin to recognize and understand that true abundance comes from here? It comes from being, it comes from recognizing our being as whole and complete already. How could you be any more abundant than the whole of reality, the whole of life? So again, it's just another way in which the mind is trying to satisfy itself by externalizing, by investing in the external, by identifying with the things. With the things. And you can open up Jesus or Buddha or Krishna or the Tao Te Ching or any one of these wonderful ancient texts, and they will all say the same thing. It's not there. It's not in the world. You'll never find it in the world, ever. You will find the kingdom of God in you. You know, nirvana is here, you know. Even the psychological traditions of the day, at least some of the more interesting ones, the ones that are really sort of on the cutting edge of inner exploration, they all say the same thing too. You know, so it's really interesting to be able to look at how all of these pointers exist in all these places. The perennial philosophy, as Aldous Huxley pointed out, existent everywhere. Everywhere you turn, everywhere you look, it's right there waiting to be discovered. So the last thing I'll cover this evening is I'll just talk about what it takes, how to really dig in and encounter ourselves. I know that I spent probably a good 6 to 9 months after my initial experience of awakening, a good 6 to 9 months being emptied out. That's the only way I can explain. It's like, you know, the initial experience of awakening was a really radical shift. It was a falling away of everything, you know, awareness, aware of itself as awareness. That's all there was in the moment of awakening. But the conditioned qualities of the mental construct and formation, or we could say it differently, we could say the experience of Bradley needed to encounter what came next in order to facilitate what's present now, right? I couldn't teach in the way that I do or share in the way that I do if I hadn't gone through the things that I went through. They were a necessary part of the unfolding that allows me to serve consciousness in the way that I do now, right? So for about 6 to 9 months, I was consistently being emptied out every single day. And I'll talk more about that as well in the synchronicity discussion next week. But it was when I was a kid, I was in the Boy Scouts. And when you got promoted in the Boy Scouts, they would turn you upside down, right? And sometimes the Scoutmaster would shake you as a joke. You know, and then they'd put the patch in your pocket or whatever. I don't know. It was a really long time ago. Right? That's sort of what awakening is on the other side of the recognition of awareness, is being turned upside down and shaken, right? So all the bullshit falls out. Right? And what this really requires of us is, again, as I said earlier, a willingness to encounter ourselves, a willingness to be radically honest with ourselves, to look at all the places in our lives where we were hurt or harmed or injured, or we participated in hurting, harming, or injuring another. And going through a process of deep forgiveness, going through the compassionate process of being fully with all of it, everything that we're feeling, all of the hurt, all of the horror, all of it, everything. Allowing it all to emerge, allowing it to all come up, allowing it to all find its way to the surface without trying to restrict any of it or control any of it or push any of it away. Now, each and every one of us, we have our own life circumstances, and perhaps we don't necessarily have the kind of flexibility that I did in my scenario, but we can still create those moments for ourselves or have those safe places for ourselves where we can set aside time in our day to do some stuff for our own benefit, right? Do some investigative work, allow ourselves, you're driving to work, man. Allow yourself to have an opportunity while you're driving to work to explore something that's heavy or hard or difficult. And you're alone. You don't have to explain your feeling states to anyone when you're in that place, right? You can be there with your tears, you can be there with your heartache, you can be there with all the difficulties, all the challenges, all the emotionality. And when you pull into the parking lot, you can wipe your tears away, take a few deep breaths, remind yourself that life is right here, being lived right now, and get on with your day. And then, you can, so I'm just using this as an example to say that, it doesn't mean that you have to basically lock yourself away for months on end in order to allow all this stuff to come up. It really can happen within your day-to-day systems and structures, within the capabilities and limitations of what's present for you. Life is always going to create those opportunities for those of us who are sincere. You're being drawn in, right? And as you're being drawn in, life is going to say, all right, well, hey, you're welcome. I'm going to give you those opportunities to deepen. I think it's a Sufi saying, I could be wrong, but I think it's a Sufi saying that for every one step you take towards God, God takes 10,000 steps towards you. So something like that, right? Just acknowledging that this process, it's an invitation into your true nature, into your true being. And life is going to respond as part of its sort of own dynamic. In order for you to accept the invitation, life has to manufacture the circumstances that allow you to accept. But don't be afraid of it. That's the real key here. We have to be willing to feel our emotions. We have to be willing to allow ourselves to hurt. At the very beginning, right, we were having this conversation about the pain, right, the physical sensation of a headache or an itch or pain in the body, right, as being sort of a metaphor or one aspect of the way our experience comes forth, right? And that the same is absolutely true of the emotional and psychological content that comes into our experience, to be present with it, to allow for it, to not shrink away from it or try to avoid it. We have to feel our way into what it is that life is asking of us. And what it's really asking is for us to embrace our authenticity, to be who it is that we truly are, here, now, in this moment. All of it. I encounter a lot of people who have expectations, right, of a teacher, right? Especially somebody who's a non-dual teacher, or who lives in the guru kind of space, right? And they have this idea that that person should live a certain way and live a certain kind of life. And the thing that, I like to try to make sure people understand is the fact that, well, what we're really talking about is non-separateness. And, if you're with a true teacher, somebody who really understands and really embodies this, they're no longer trying to project an image. I'm not suggesting that the gurus in India do that necessarily. There are some that do, right? But what I am suggesting is that, This isn't about presenting or projecting an image. This is about saying, hey man, life is messy. Life is chaotic. Life is hard. Even the Buddha said that life is suffering, right? Jesus got thrown onto a cross, man. I mean, you know, this stuff really demands a lot of us when we're really looking at this from this position of radical self-honesty, when we're really sincere and earnestness in our process of inner exploration. It's very demanding. It's very hard. It's very difficult. It's the means by which growth occurs. If you look at some of the histories of teachers or beings who have been really profoundly effective at communicating some of these things, you'll see people who have stories of such absolute heartbreak that you are astounded by the fact that they're even able to be in the world. And so what happened for them is this, what emerged was this willingness, you know, hey man, this is hard. Let me be with it. Let me see where it goes. Let me surrender into what it is that life is attempting to show me. What life is trying to reveal. What life is inviting me into. Let me surrender into that. Let me give up myself. Let me give myself over to this process. And in doing so, they found the radical freedom of being that allowed them to encounter life as life is and to say, okay, I see. And out of that, they grew, they deepened, they learned, and they cultivated the wisdom and compassion necessary in order to help guide others. They didn't shrink from it. And that's what we're being asked to, is really encounter ourselves, to be fully present with ourselves. Not to try to project an image or be someone that we're not, but to be authentically who we are. Not a perfect image of who it is that we think we should be, or what other people might expect of us, but to just be who we are. So we've got a few minutes left. I've covered a lot, and I didn't really go into some of the more nitty-gritty things, you know, really like how to be present with some of this. What I would suggest is that the mindfulness and meditation techniques that we covered last week, combined with this sort of, let's call it a request of sorts, right? To begin to examine and inquire into your own sort of history of experience, your own conditioning from childhood through, you know, adulthood, and what brought you into this place that you're in now, right? To begin to look at those things in your own good time, you know, in a way that's comfortable for you. There's no homework, you know, there's no one's pushing or forcing anyone to do anything they're not ready to do. But it's just, again, it's a soft and gentle invitation to say, hey, you know, the things that I'm talking about are true. We all carry this load. We all carry these historical events. We've all been shaped by the things that made us who we are. What is that for you? What does that look like for you? What does that mean for you? You already know the things that you're stuck on or the things you're challenged by. You already have a sense of what needs your attention, because suffering is pretty easy to recognize. And if there's suffering, it means that's where your work is. So start there. Where's my suffering today? Where's my work today? And let me just bite it off in little bits and pieces, right? We don't need to jump in all at once into the deep end of the pool and go, oh my God, I must burn myself alive in order to wake up. Again, that's just another striving. It's just another idea that we have. It's another success model. If I just throw myself harder at the wall, maybe I won't bounce off, but Physics doesn't work that way. You throw yourself harder at the wall, you bounce off further, right? You know, so how do you soften yourself? How do you soften yourself? How do you make yourself permeable in a way so that you can just walk right through the wall like David Copperfield? So comments or questions or thoughts or anything that anyone would like to put forward or share. How about the folks on Facebook? Although it takes like 20 seconds for you guys to see anything I say on Zoom. All right. So again, I will follow this session up with a post to the Facebook group and an email sharing some of the resources I've talked about. I'll also include a link. Like I said, I did a talk at one point on suffering as our greatest teacher, so I'll include a link to that, which goes into some of this a little bit more deeply. Maybe I'll also include links from past sessions that I've done on this topic that did get a little deeper into some of the more nitty-gritty stuff. I just really want to encourage people to take advantage or make use of therapy in an appropriate way to really engage things that need real attention. So, one last chance to see if anybody has anything they want to share.
A lot of good material, Bradley. Thanks so much.
Of course, yeah. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you're here tonight.
No, I'm glad I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
All right then. Well, everyone, again, next week will be fun. Next week we will be talking about synchronicity, and it's one of my favorite topics. It's really ultimately what broke me wide open. I'm very hard-headed, and I needed to see. I needed to be hit with a hammer and broken open by things I simply couldn't explain or simply couldn't ignore or deny. And so it'll be a really interesting conversation next week as we start to talk about what it means to pay attention to synchronicity and how it is that synchronicity can really begin to demonstrate itself. Like I said earlier, life is the teacher. Right? Consciousness, being, that's the teacher. And one of the ways that the teacher communicates is through what we refer to or call synchronicity. So that's the conversation we'll be having next week. And I hope to see you all there. If you're watching this video, afterwards, please also remember that as part of this series, we have a few free one-on-one sessions that I've set aside for people. You are welcome in some of the emails. I think I've included the instructions for setting those up. If you'd like to have one of those discussions, there's room for one of those this week, specifically to talk about anything that you might want to talk about. Now, again, I'm a student. I'm not a licensed therapist. So if you really need to go into something that has a lot of depth to it, chances are I'll refer you to somebody who can be more helpful. But at least having sort of an initial conversation if there's something that's really challenging for you. So that we can bring it into the light of awareness and see how it can be used in order to connect with and deepen into the understanding of who you truly are and how to embody that understanding. So please feel free to take advantage of those opportunities if you feel so moved. Otherwise, I will see you all next week. It's been lovely. Thank you so much for coming and for being a part of tonight's discussion and for allowing me to share from this place. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.